Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I'm the Chair of Research and the Postdoctoral Fellows Program and a Senior Fellow at the Center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It is my pleasure to welcome our speakers, Henrik Hiim and Øystein Tunsjø. Henrik Hiim is a professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies at the Norwegian Defense University College. His main interests are nuclear strategy and nonproliferation, as well as Chinese foreign and security policy. Dr. Hiim's work has appeared in outlets such as International Security, International Affairs, Journal of Contemporary China, Survival, and Foreign Affairs. Øystein Tunsjø is a professor and head of security in the Asia program at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies at the Norwegian Defense University College. Dr. Tunsjø is an author of several books, including The Return of Bipolarity in World Politics, China, the United States in Geostructural Realism, Security and Profits in China's Energy Policy, Hedging Against Risk. He has also published articles in journals such as the Washington Quarterly, National Interest, and Survival. Their talk today introduces a new article that explores insights from the instability-stability paradox to compare the prospect for limited war between the United States and China to the U.S. Soviet rivalry during the Cold War. They develop a logic that argues that key factors, such as geography and the prevalence of territorial disputes, can affect the intensity of the stability-instability paradox and may make limited wars appear safer to fight and increase both China and the U.S.'s willingness to take on these additional risks. This, coupled with the nature of the East Asian theater, may similarly make the risk of limited nuclear employment greater. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. They will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During their talk, please feel free to get your questions ready, and you can start raising your hands electronically and typing questions into the chat while they are speaking. Thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I will try to share the screen here, share our presentation.
Excellent. First of all, Rupal, thank you very much for inviting us to present this paper, which is work in progress, but we look very much forward to getting your feedback and your comments and questions. As you can see from the title of this paper, we put emphasis on what we call this double trouble, which basically points to our findings in this paper, where we have compared U.S.-China rivalry in East Asia with U.S. Soviet rivalry in Europe during the Cold War. And we are basically arguing that there is a higher risk of limited conventional war in contemporary East Asia that could also trigger limited nuclear use. So hence the title, Double Trouble. We build the paper on the stability-instability paradox. And as Rupal mentioned in the introduction, we emphasize the role of geography and territorial disputes and make the case that this affects the intensity of the stability-instability paradox. And then also we emphasize the role of geography, but also technological developments in making the case for the risk of limited nuclear use. So we start out by looking at a lot of sort of, in general, literature that address the risk of war between the United States and China. And there is an abundance of literature here, and it can be categorized into different boxes just to make it a little bit easier. So you have a lot of writers such as Graham Allison, Odd Arne Westad, who takes a historical view focusing on great power rivalry and the risk of war in multipolar systems, comparing U.S.-China rivalry to for instance, the great power rivalry prior to the First World War. We don't think this is a very good analogy or a good starting point for analysis, basically because multipolar systems didn't have the the sort of emphasis on nuclear weapons. It wasn't developed, and we think that it is difficult to compare U.S.-China rivalry today with the kind of rivalry we saw during multipolar systems in the past. Then there are a number of other literature looking at power transition theory. We don't think that is so useful because we're not making the argument that China is transitioning, above the United States. There is still a power gap between the United States and China. We also do not follow the argument of peak theory. We don't think China has peaked yet. And we also doesn't follow the kind of Mearsheimer's argument about the role of hegemony and China seeking hegemony. We think China has more limited goals, in particular related to Taiwan. So for us, the kind of starting point is to draw on a book. I published this back in 2018, making the case for the return of bipolarity in international politics, arguing that the United States and China are much more powerful than any other states. And even though China is not as powerful as the United States, they don't need to close the gap. There is no need for power parity to examine this rivalry from a bipolar perspective. The Soviet Union was never as powerful as the United States during the previous bipolar system. So we take this as our starting point. And then, of course, there is a nuclear deterrence. There is a mutually assured destruction here. And also there is the argument that bipolar systems should be more stable than multipolar systems, drawing in particular on Kenneth Walt's theory. So that is the starting point for looking at it, comparing two bipolar systems, which very few studies have done. And then once we get into that, we put forward our research question, which is basically to look at whether the risk of limited war between China and the United States in contemporary East Asia is greater than the risk of war between the United States and Soviet Union in Europe. And here we then make the double trouble argument, basically pointing out that the stability-instability paradox is more intense when we look at the U.S.-China rivalry, and that there is a higher risk of limited conventional war than during the Cold War in Europe, and also that there is a risk of limited nuclear use compared to the Cold War situation. And the main sort of argument that we are drawing on is that why there is this heightened risk of conventional limited war is that the United States and China are confronting each other in the maritime domain of East Asia and not on land or the Asian mainland, so to say. This is very different, of course, than what the United States and the Soviet Union, who had this standoff in the heart of Europe, on the European continent. And also there is a big difference between the so-called status quo in Europe, the East-West divide, the fact that there wasn't any sovereignty disputes between the Soviet Union and the United States or US allies in Europe, while there are several territorial disputes, whether in the East China Sea over Taiwan or the South China Sea between US allies and China in contemporary East Asia. And then we sort of go into the stability-instability paradox. We look at how this can, this was the argument during the Cold War that stability on a strategic level could make conflict on a lower level appear safer to fight. And we sort of look at this through how limited war can be sort of bargained, so to say, or you can establish salient thresholds, and you can have a limited war in sort of ways of the means, the weapons use, the targets, or even then, of course, the scope of the war, and very much tied to geographical factors. And we also, as Henrik will talk about in just a little bit, we also talk about the possibility of limited nuclear war. So the limited war theory is, of course, drawing on a lot of classic literature of Schelling, Oshkod, Corbett, Halperin, and so forth. And we just point out here that geographical factors are very crucial, whether it's mountains, whether it's rivers, whether it's islands, whether it's peninsula. So geographical features are important to establish tacit bargaining and to reach salient thresholds. And then we then compare the geography of East Asia with Europe, and arguing that the intensity of the stability-instability paradox is higher in today's rivalry compared to the U.S. Soviet rivalry. If then geography facilitates certain bargainings about the limits or the stake in the conflict, then the paradox becomes more intense. And conversely, the paradox is less likely to be as intense. Its geography does not facilitate such tacit bargaining. And in the case of East Asia, it is clear that since the United States and China are confronting each other at sea, it is very different. A war over Taiwan is very different than a war over West Germany at the heart of Europe during the Cold War. So in East Asia, whether it's in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Island disputes, or whether it's over Taiwan or the South China Sea, there are more opportunities to limit a potential war. While in Europe, it was a very compact theater, it was sort of very difficult to limit the war if it started by either the Soviet Union or the United States crossing the East-West divide. And also, I think in Europe, because the United States were confronting the Soviet Union on the ground in Europe, they had to rely on nuclear weapons because they were conventionally military inferior to the Soviet army. And that also created a lot of tension and also a very high stake in the conflict. While in East Asia, the United States does not need to rely on nuclear weapons to the same extent. For instance, President Biden on 4 occasions said that US would defend Taiwan, but he didn't say that they would use nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan. While in Europe, the United States were very explicit on that they would use nuclear weapons to defend West Europe, whether it's massive retaliation or mutually assured destruction or a flexible response. And this is a very sort of crucial finding in the comparison between East Asia and Europe today. Europe in the past. So I'll let Henrik talk a little bit about also the sovereignty and the issue over status quo.
Sure, thanks, Øystein. So essentially, right, what we're arguing is that the stability-instability paradox, that stability at the strategic level could make a limited use of or a limited military conflict more likely. That's the outset here. But then, in addition, there needs to be something sort of sparking that conflict, right? And also here we say that there are these sort of crucial differences between Cold War Europe and what we're currently seeing in East Asia. Because, I mean, in Cold War Europe, the territorial status quo was largely settled at the onset of the Cold War. Berlin and Berlin's status was a partial exception to this. And I mean, Berlin remained obviously a hot issue throughout the Cold War. But the United States managed to largely address it by placing tripwire forces in Berlin, which stabilized the situation and made sure, that the United States would be massively involved in the conflict if the Soviets were to attack Berlin, which was obviously then located sort of deep within adversary territory. If you look at the situation in East Asia today, it's essentially much more combustible, right? There is a lot more which could trigger a conflict. And we know from a lot of literature that territorial disputes is sort of the most frequent source of armed conflict in international politics. When states choose to fight territorial disputes as one of the issues they fight over most frequently, or sovereignty disputes, and particularly if the disputed territory has high strategic or intangible, could be symbolic value. We also know that, particularly Taiwan has both a significant strategic value, but even more of a high intangible value for the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party has essentially signaled for decades that Taiwan should never be separated from the motherland. So the stakes, in a sense, for China at least, are quite high, and the disputes are quite intense, which makes East Asia much more combustible than we would argue that Cold War Europe ever was. So because of the combination of these two factors, right, the different geography and a much greater prevalence of territorial disputes, the stability-instability paradox, we would argue, it's much more intense in East Asia today than it was in Cold War Europe. So the prospects for a limited conventional war is much higher than it was during the Cold War in Europe. We also, in our paper, run through some of the sort of historical evidence on this and what sort of leaders have believed about the prospects of keeping a war limited. And what you see is that, during the Cold War, despite, talk about keeping a conflict limited, preventing an all-out nuclear war, particularly with the onset of the flexible response strategy from, the early 1960s, Cold War leaders, and especially Soviet leaders, never really believed that a war in Europe could be kept limited. They always thought that the end result would be highly likely to be an all-out nuclear conflict. Despite the fact that Soviet leaders started sort of mimicking to a certain extent some of the thinking that became prevalent with the flexible response strategy, Soviet leaders never really believed in limited war, and neither, could you argue, did British military leaders or British leaders or many US leaders also. There was great skepticism about the idea that a war can be kept limited in any way or form if it broke out in the central theater in Europe. If you fast forward and look at the situation in East Asia today, that is quite different. Current US or particularly Chinese leaders sort of see a limited conflict as the most likely scenario if a conflict were to break out in that region. US leaders have called Taiwan their pacing scenario, and China has since the early 1990s, since its shift in its military strategic guidelines from 1993, sort of identified a local war, as they would call it, which is something quite similar to a limited war, as the most likely scenario that the People's Liberation Army is facing. So that is what Chinese military leaders are preparing for, a limited conflict in the maritime domain. And there seems to be, even if it's not pronounced as such, a relatively strong belief among Chinese leaders in the stability-instability paradox, and that, you know, war can be fought below the nuclear threshold, so to say, or under the nuclear shadow, and be kept limited. So, I mean, again, this is kind of, you know, the key finding here would be that a conventional conflict appears much more likely in East Asia today than it did during the Cold War in Europe. Now, if a conventional war were to break out, a further question is, like, how likely is limited nuclear use in that case? Limited nuclear use, just to be very clear about that, is a bit of a contested, I mean, sort of concept even. Some would argue that it's almost a bit of a misnomer, because, I mean, if nuclear weapons were ever used, the risk of escalation would be extremely high, and, you know, that skepticism is understandable. But we would argue that, you know, again, the geography in particular of East Asia makes the risk of limited nuclear use greater in East Asia today. Or put differently, the escalation risks in the case that nuclear weapons were used would probably be lower than they were in the European land theater of the Cold War, and hence limited nuclear use is more likely. Just sort of broadly speaking, why, you know, would any state consider limited nuclear use or threatening limited nuclear use? There are a number of states that have threats of or limited nuclear use sort of baked into their military doctrines. And broadly speaking, the purposes could be either for coercing a adversary to back down because of threats, or even employment of nuclear weapons in a limited way, or to achieve concrete military objectives, as was the case during the Cold War. You know, that was the thinking anyway. So, I mean, to achieve the objectives such as halting tank divisions, sinking enemy surface vessels, or other purposes to achieve concrete military objectives. If you look at the Cold War and the threat of limited nuclear use, I mean, both sides, both the Soviet Union and the United States, had, you know, extensive plans of such use. They developed large arsenal of limited nuclear options, so to say, limited different options: gravity bombs, short range missiles equipped with warheads with limited yields, nuclear depth charges, artillery shells, mines. So there was extensive, you know, sort of arsenals of so-called tactical nuclear weapons on both sides during the Cold War. But the problem was, and I mean, during the course of the Cold War, this became more and more clear that the threat of limited nuclear use, particularly in Cold War in the European theater, was never really credible, because, I mean, it would have been disastrous. The fatalities would likely have been in the millions, and that was largely because the European theater was so compact and there were so many targets. So if you wanted to stop, you know, try to halt divisions of advancing Soviet armor, the number of nuclear weapons you would have had to use in anything beyond the demonstration shot would have been massive. So, I mean, there were some influential studies that emerged, particularly during the 1980s, from people like Desmond Ball. There's another one we have here on the slide, which basically tried to sort of assess, you know, the potential fatalities if a limited nuclear war broke out. And Desmond Ball assessed them to be, from anywhere from 2 to 20 million if you assume extensive use of nuclear weapons with restraints, and even more if there were no restraints at all, obviously. And there were other key problems too, with the idea of a limited nuclear war in Cold War Europe. For instance, another problem was how command and control systems were not well set up and way too rugged for keeping any sort of control beyond the first sort of round of use of nuclear weapons. If you look at East Asia today, we would argue that is quite different. So if we set out by examining, like the capabilities on both sides, there's been a bit of a shift. Traditionally, China has not really had weapons sort of suitable for limited nuclear use, and really developed or at least deployed tactical nuclear weapons. But now China has, particularly the DF-26, a theater range system that it has deployed in quite significant numbers. Many of them are conventionally armed, but some are also nuclear armed. And it gives China a nuclear precision strike capability for the first time. It's a little bit uncertain still whether China has developed a sort of lower yield warhead for the DF-26. The US DoD assesses that it probably seeks such a capability, indicating that it hasn't been deployed yet. But it might not need a lower yield option, no lower yield warhead for limited use due to particularly the precision of the DF-26. I mean, the United States obviously also has several lower yield or variable yield capabilities available, and there is increasing debate about developing more systems. The sea-launched cruise missile is an obvious example, which is now in development, right? And because of the precision revolution also, we would argue on the capability sides, there are sort of fewer constraints on limited nuclear use in East Asia. You also see increasing concerns on both sides that the other may resort to limited nuclear use. This is something I've written about also elsewhere, but I would argue that you're perhaps entering sort of a spiral of sorts. The US DoD acknowledged that China is increasingly concerned about the United States using lower yield weapons in a Taiwan scenario. And some of these concerns started emerging around 2018. And I mean, several US sources have also stressed the risk of Chinese limited nuclear use. For instance, the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review stressed that the US needs to improve its capability to respond to Chinese nuclear use if deterrence fails. So you see this increasing concern on both sides about limited nuclear use. Now, turning to the geography of this, again, we think compared to the Cold War European theater, the theater of East Asia as of today sort of facilitates, to put it that way, limited nuclear use to a much larger extent. Because it's a maritime theater, the number of targets are lower, they are more dispersed. So in addition to coercion, it's kind of easier to imagine that you could achieve sort of concrete military benefits through limited nuclear use in a conflict. Possible targets, and this is something we debate a bit in the paper also, could include surface vessels, both on the Chinese and the US side, aircraft carriers, for instance, potentially, but also airfields and ports. There are also other sources. For instance, I mean, the CSIS conducted this war game recently where they tried to war game some of these risks. And they found that ground forces in Taiwan could potentially also be a target for both China and the US, actually. Obviously, at the outset, conventional weapons would probably be preferable for both sides. But there are some of these targets that may be easier to hold at risk with nuclear weapons, airfields, for instance, but potentially also surface vessels. We also highlight that in a war of attrition, ammunition stocks could deplete, so that could make nuclear use more likely. But perhaps most importantly, particularly China, but potentially also the US, could see limited nuclear use as more attractive if it believed it was facing imminent defeat in a conflict, for instance, over or most likely perhaps over Taiwan. So, I mean, if we compare the US and China a bit more in depth on this, right? How do we assess, or what do we say about, the likelihood of limited nuclear use? I think in the Chinese case, it's important to point to, a few things first. Obviously, I mean, China's had a no first use policy since it first developed nuclear weapons in 1964, and there has not been any overt change in that policy. They still stick to the no first use pledge, obviously. But on the other hand, it is a pledge. It's not a pledge which can be monitored in any way, obviously. So, how can we be sure that pledge would hold if Chinese leaders believed they were losing a conventional conflict over Taiwan? Obviously, we can't. And one thing which I think is important to mention in that context is that, I mean, the stakes, if they are on the verge of losing a conflict over Taiwan for Chinese leaders, could potentially be very high or even existential. Losing a conflict over Taiwan could mean the end of the Chinese Communist Party in the worst case. So we should also assume that Chinese leaders in such a setting would potentially be quite risk tolerant. And again, I mean, they could initiate limited nuclear use for coercive purposes, but potentially also to achieve military objectives. What about the US? I mean, one question which we debate a bit here is whether the stakes in a conflict over Taiwan would sort of warrant, in the US case, taking the risk of limited nuclear employment. And that's, obviously a hard question to answer, but also for the US, the prospect of losing or believing that they're losing a conventional conflict could look quite dire. And in that CSIS war game we mentioned, there are some iterations that lead to US nuclear first use because they believe they are on the verge of losing a conflict. Also, I mean, just to put that out there, there are, there is increasing debate about this. Many of you will probably, of course, be well aware of this, but, there's been increasing debate about whether the United States should rely on threats of limited first use to a greater extent to deter China, or even, consider, whether it could be worth it to engage in limited nuclear employment during a conflict. And there are some, Gregory Weaver, for instance, I believe, and Matthew Kronig, who have described a massed Chinese invasion fleet, because it would have to be massed before, it launched the invasion of Taiwan, as an ideal target for a nuclear weapon. Basically, you could sink a lot of Chinese ships through limited nuclear use in that case. We are not saying that in any way that we're endorsing that idea at all, but I mean, this is an idea or debates that we think will become more prevalent, particularly as the conventional balance of power appears to be tilting in China's favor in the areas around close to China in the Taiwan Strait. So, you know, gambling for resurrection, if it, you know, believes it's on the verge of losing a conflict, that could be a potential scenario which could lead to at least sort of threats of limited nuclear employment for the United States. But also, of course, you know, responding to Chinese limited use. I think, yeah, we're at the conclusion. So basically, just to wrap this up and repeat some of our key findings here, what we're arguing is that, you know, we're in a new bipolar system. Nuclear deterrence is contributing to making, you know, things sort of very stable at the strategic level. The combination of bipolarity and, you know, the two poles possessing large arsenals of nuclear weapons, particularly with China's nuclear buildup, makes the situation stable at the strategic level. But because of the different geography and the prevalence of territorial disputes in East Asia, we argue that the stability-instability paradox is much more intense than it was in Cold War Europe. Of course, we want to stress this, like, none of this is destiny, of course, and we're not saying that, you know, a limited war, or much less a limited nuclear war, is sort of bound to break out. But we think it's important to point out that the situation at the outset here makes this current bipolar rivalry, the US-China rivalry, more war-prone than the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yes, and I think that's it. Thanks.